This is a Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber, and it is aimed at leaders who already suspect they know which system will be the last one left in their estate. You have probably heard it mentioned with a wry joke in a quarterly review. Someone calls it the old mainframe, that creaking line of business app, or the thing nobody wants to touch. Everyone laughs, and then attention shifts to cloud migrations, new platforms, and shiny transformation projects. Yet, if you watch long enough, a pattern appears. Modernization waves roll through, executives change, new tools arrive, and one or two systems never move. This conversation is about that stubborn survivor, and what it really means to choose a specific day to turn it off, on purpose, without gambling the business.
For most organizations, that last legacy system is not just technical debt, it is a quiet concentration of operational, security, and regulatory risk wrapped in business history. It is often the only place certain workflows truly live, the system auditors still ask about, but nobody fully understands, and the dependency no one wants to put their name on. Around it, the estate might look impressively modern: cloud-native services, automation, new data platforms, but the risk story still has an old gravitational center. Over the next few years, boards, regulators, and insurers will continue to ask why those critical processes still depend on something that everyone admits is fragile and hard to change. The point here is not to shame anyone for having legacy. It is to give you a clearer mental model and better language for treating that last system as a deliberate, time-bound choice. If you walk your environment with your architecture or operations leads and ask a simple question, which system will be the last one standing? They usually know the answer in seconds. It might be a mainframe that still clears a meaningful slice of revenue, a bespoke client-server application built decades ago, or a vendor package so heavily customized that upgrading it feels like open-heart surgery. On architecture diagrams, it often sits off to the side, drawn as an awkward box with a tangle of lines running in and out. In everyday reality, it anchors entire business processes. Month-end close cannot happen without it. A critical regulatory report is only correct when it comes from that system. Some customers or products are still handled the old way, which means through that box, whether anyone likes it or not.
What makes this system different from all the other old platforms you have already retired is not just its age. It is the density of business meaning that has accumulated inside it. Over the years, people have embedded policy choices, exception paths, and edge cases directly into the code and the data structures. Things that should live in clear, maintainable procedures are expressed only as behaviors inside this application. The truth about how you calculate a fee, process a claim, honor a grandfathered agreement, or sequence a sensitive workflow exists nowhere else. If you listen closely, you will hear stakeholders talk about it almost as a person. They say, "It just knows how we work." That sentence is a warning. It tells you the system has become a kind of institutional memory, not just an asset on a spreadsheet.
There is also a narrative layer around it. Big systems that stay alive this long usually have war stories attached. People remember the project that launched it in a crisis, the release that kept a regulator happy, or the heroic fix during a major outage that people still talk about in the corridor. Those stories carry emotional and political weight. They create a sense that the system is part of the organization's identity. From a leadership perspective, that matters, because retiring the system is not just a technical migration. You are asking people to let go of an artifact that has been woven into their careers and their sense of competence. That helps explain why this platform keeps surviving modernization waves, even when almost everyone is willing to admit that it is risky, expensive, and hard to secure.
Once you accept that one system is likely to be the last legacy standing, the next realization is more uncomfortable. The organization probably does not fully understand what it touches. Over time, teams have wired it into new platforms through batch jobs, messaging buses, shared databases, and one-off scripts living on forgotten servers.
Reporting functions may reach directly into it because the data warehouse never quite caught up. Identity and access flows might depend on it indirectly, perhaps through a nightly job that populates entanglements for downstream applications. Individually, none of these connections seem decisive. Taken together, they turn the legacy system into invisible glue holding important parts of the estate together.
This is where official architecture diagrams and configuration databases start to mislead you. They usually show the sanctioned picture: documented interfaces, supported feeds, well-known application programming interfaces, and approved integrations. The dependencies that really stop you from turning off a legacy system often live in messier places. A long-running script that nobody wants to touch because it just works. A spreadsheet macro that a finance analyst uses to pull data directly from the legacy database. A third-party reconciliation tool that expects a file in a format the legacy system has produced for 15 years. Many of these paths were created by people who have moved on, or by teams that no longer exist. When you ask for impact analysis, you receive confident answers built on incomplete maps. As a leader, that is a dangerous position. You feel like you have enough information to decide, but you do not actually see the true blast radius.
Moving beyond guesswork takes more than a single discovery workshop. The organizations that handle decommissioning well treat it as an opportunity to raise the bar on observability and data lineage across the estate. They instrument the legacy system and its surroundings to see who calls it, which jobs touch it, what data flows through it, and which downstream processes depend on those outputs. They collect this information over weeks and months, not just a few days. At the same time, they pair the technical view with human interviews. Instead of asking teams whether they use the old system, they ask more grounded questions. Where do you get this number? Where do you pull this file from? What has to work for your month-end ritual to succeed? Gradually, a much more honest picture emerges of how deeply the last legacy system is woven into everyday work.
Once that picture starts to form, the conversation shifts. The way leaders talk about turning off a legacy system usually begins in project language: timelines, milestones, feature parity, migration phases, and test cycles. That language is familiar, and it fits the way most organizations manage delivery. The problem is that the last legacy system sits at the intersection of risk, revenue, compliance, and reputation. Treating its retirement purely as a migration project understates the stakes and buries essential decisions inside technical work streams. A more accurate framing is to treat it as a deliberate business decision. Are we going to keep absorbing the risk and opportunity cost of this system, or are we choosing to exit with all the effort and disruption that implies?
Once you adopt that lens, the questions at the executive table change. You stop asking only whether the technology team can finish by the end of a quarter. You start asking what it costs in risk and agility to keep this system alive year after year. You ask how it constrains your ability to adapt core workflows, serve new customer segments, or respond to new regulations. You ask what happens to your security posture, your incident response story, and your resilience narrative if a large part of the organization still depends on something fragile and opaque. You also become more honest about ownership. The business unit that relies on the system, the finance function that funds it, the risk and compliance teams that explain it to regulators, and the technology group that sustains it all share the decision. Without that shared ownership, the decommissioning effort quietly slips behind louder initiatives whenever priorities shift. This framing allows for more explicit trade-offs. You might decide as a leadership team that you will accept certain technical risks for a defined period because the cost or disruption of replacement is genuinely high. If that is a conscious choice, you can pair it with targeted controls, monitoring, and a real end-of-life date. You might choose to move the most sensitive data and workflows away from the legacy platform first, then address the remaining functions as capacity allows. The key is that the choice is explicit, written down, and revisited at the right forums. It is no longer the unplanned outcome of "we never quite got to it." When you treat retirement as a strategic lever rather than a housekeeping chore, the last legacy system becomes a managed, time-bound risk instead of an embarrassing relic everyone pretends not to see.
The next challenge is to make turning it off something you can model and rehearse, not a single cliff-edge moment. Leaders often underestimate how much uncertainty surrounds the shutdown itself. Even if you have a reasonable understanding of which processes depend on the system, you rarely know in detail how they will behave when the dependency is gone. A more useful mental model comes from safety-critical industries. You assume you do not know everything, you design for surprises, and you practice the event before it happens. The goal is not to write a perfect plan, but to build a plan that fails safely.
Risk modeling for decommissioning needs more than a generic impact matrix. It benefits from narrative thinking. If we switch this system off on a given weekend, what happens to revenue flows, customer commitments, regulatory timelines, and operational capacity over the following hours and days? Which metrics would tell us early that something is going wrong, and who will be watching them in real time? This is where security, operations, and business continuity teams can add real value. They can help define leading indicators such as queue backlogs, error rates in downstream systems, unusual spikes in customer contact, missed or late reports, and anomalies in monitoring. They can also work with you to identify worst-case scenarios and to agree on specific mitigations ahead of time, rather than relying on a vague promise to roll back if needed.
Rehearsals are where the plan moves from theory to practice. You can run paths in parallel while the legacy system is still live, feeding both the new and old workflows and comparing results. You can turn off non-critical functions that depend on the legacy platform before attempting the full cutover. You can build a test environment that reflects production constraints as honestly as possible and perform dark shutdowns there, watching how the rest of the stack behaves. These exercises reveal broken assumptions, missing runbook steps, and unclear decision thresholds. On the actual day, your teams should feel like they are following a script they have seen before, not improvising under pressure. They should know who decides whether to continue or pause, who speaks to customers if something goes wrong, and what conditions trigger each step.
Even with good modeling and rehearsal, decommissioning can still stall if you ignore the human dynamics wrapped around the system. Behind every last legacy platform, there is a small cast of people who keep it alive. There is often a long-time business owner who understands every exception path and whose credibility depends on the system's reliability. There is a hero engineer who can fix anything in it at 3 in the morning and quietly enjoys the status that brings. There are managers who worry that changing the system will expose fragile processes, create new audit findings, or require them to explain uncomfortable trade-offs. These people are not villains. In many cases, they have saved the organization from serious pain. But their incentives and fears are real, and they shape how the organization approaches the idea of shutdown.
When you declare that it is time to retire the system, you are not just swapping one piece of technology for another, you are touching role definitions, power structures, and personal narratives. The hero engineer may feel they are being asked to dismantle their own job security. The business owner may worry that the new platform will not respect years of hard-fought edge cases and special agreements. If those concerns are not surfaced and addressed, they show up as passive resistance. You see repeated claims that the organization is not ready, that the replacement is not mature enough, or that regulators will never accept the new approach. You see scope creep and acceptance criteria that no system could realistically meet. On the surface, progress is blocked by open issues. Underneath, it is blocked by unresolved human risk.
Effective leaders treat these people as critical partners in the decommissioning effort. That means giving them visible roles in shaping acceptance criteria, reviewing the behavior of the new platform, and designing fallback options. It means creating structured ways for them to transfer knowledge, documenting key workflows, explaining exception paths, and recording the stories that live only in their heads. It also means providing new forms of status and responsibility in the future state, rather than simply stripping away their influence. At the same time, leaders need to intentionally unwind unhealthy hero dependencies. Cross-training, shared on-call models, and transparent documentation are not just operational hygiene, they are preconditions for turning off a system without being held hostage by a single expert. If you step back from this story, the last legacy system offers one more lesson. It proves that modern is only a phase. Today's flagship platforms and carefully designed architectures will eventually feel dated. The question is not whether they will age, but whether you set them up to age gracefully. An organization that has survived one painful decommissioning has a chance to encode those lessons into how it builds new systems. That starts with a simple principle. Every significant system should be born with a retirement plan. Not a vague intention to sunset it one day, but clear exit criteria, expectations about data portability, and accountable ownership for the decision to turn it off.
Treating exit strategies as a first-class architectural concern changes design choices. Data models are built with the assumption that other systems will need to read them directly one day without reverse engineering. Integrations flow through defined interfaces rather than hidden coupling to internal schemas. Documentation and operational guides describe not only how to keep the system healthy, but also how to unwind its dependencies safely. When you negotiate with vendors, you look for contract terms that support eventual exit, commitments around exporting data in usable formats, realistic notice periods for end-of-life changes, and assistance during transitions. None of this guarantees a painless shutdown, but it transforms decommissioning from an act of digital archaeology into a managed engineering problem.
At the governance level, you can bring exit thinking into portfolio decisions. Architecture and risk councils can require that major initiatives spell out not just why the system should exist and how it will be delivered, but also under what conditions it should be replaced or retired. Portfolio reviews can look for systems that have quietly drifted past their expected lifespan and ask for a renewed case to keep them alive. Boards and executive committees can add one simple question to the discussion of major platforms. What is the plan for the day we no longer want this system? Over time, your culture starts to value not just the speed of standing systems up, but the grace with which you stand them down. In the end, the last legacy system is a mirror. It reflects how your organization makes decisions, manages risk, values its own history, and handles human incentives. At its core, this topic is about treating that system as a deliberate, time-bound risk choice instead of background noise. A stubborn platform that has outlived multiple modernization waves is more than a technical artifact. It is a dense knot of business logic, stories, and relationships that will not untangle itself. When you name it explicitly, when you map its invisible glue honestly, and when you acknowledge the people whose identities are tied to it, you move from vague talk about modernization to a concrete, answerable question. What will it take, here, to turn this system off safely and on purpose?
Bringing that question into the open changes how you lead. You stop accepting soft reassurances that we will get to it after the next project and start asking for real risk narratives, real evidence of dependencies, and real rehearsals for the turnoff. You treat decommissioning as a cross-functional decision that belongs in the same conversations as strategy, investment, and risk appetite, rather than as a side job for infrastructure teams. As you work through the shutdown, you use the experience to change how you design and govern new systems, so today's strategic platforms arrive with exit strategies from day one.
If you want a place to start, it can be as simple as taking 2 questions into your next leadership meeting. First, which system would hurt you most if it failed tomorrow? Second, why have you never set a real date to replace or retire it? The discussion that follows will tell you whether your last legacy system still has a quiet grip on your future, or whether you are ready to decide how and when its story ends.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.